The soft hum of the city outside served as a stark contrast to the silence inside Carson Miller's sprawling mansion. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, casting blurred shadows of raindrops onto the marble floor. Carson pushed open the heavy wooden door, his mind preoccupied with the numbers he'd been crunching all day. Business was as ruthless as ever, and tonight all he wanted was a quiet dinner and a glass of scotch. But something stopped him mid-step. There, sitting just beyond the doorway, was a small figure huddled in the shadows. She was drenched from head to toe, her thin jacket clinging to her frail frame as if it were no match for the cold. For a moment, Carson thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. This was no place for a child, especially in weather like this. "Hey!" he called out cautiously, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but not unkind. The figure flinched, shrinking back against the stone wall. "What are you doing here?" The girl looked up, and Carson's chest tightened involuntarily. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her hollow cheeks and wide, frightened eyes told a story he didn't need words to understand: hunger, exhaustion, and perhaps something even darker. Yet there was a spark in her gaze, a defiant strength that didn't belong in someone so small. My mum sent me," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the rain. She said you're the only one who can help us." Carson blinked, trying to make sense of the words. Him? Help? There had to be a mistake. "Who's your mother?" he asked, lowering his voice, though the name meant little to him yet. The girl hesitated, clutching a crumpled piece of paper tightly to her chest. She didn't answer, and Carson noticed her trembling hands. The realization hit him. She wasn't just cold. She was terrified. "Look, kid," he said, softening his tone, "you can't just sit out here. Come inside before you freeze to death." He opened the door wider and stepped aside, signaling for her to follow. The girl hesitated, but eventually stood, her steps hesitant, her thin sneakers squelching against the wet stone. Carson motioned toward the sitting room, his sharp eyes scanning her for any injuries or signs of harm as she crossed the threshold. Ellis, his longtime housekeeper, appeared from the hallway, her eyes narrowing at the unexpected visitor. "Mr. Miller, who is—" "I don't know yet," Carson interrupted, holding up a hand. "Get her a towel and something warm to eat." Ellis pursed her lips, clearly wanting to ask more, but nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Carson turned his attention back to the girl, who was now standing awkwardly in the middle of his immaculate living room, dripping water onto the Persian rug. "What's your name?" Carson asked, walking over to her with a deliberate slowness, as though she might bolt if he moved too fast. "Bella," she whispered, clutching the piece of paper even tighter. Carson crouched down to meet her gaze. "Bella, huh? That's a nice name." He glanced at the paper. "What's that you've got there?" Her grip on the note tightened further. It's from my mum," she said. "She told me to give it to you." Carson raised an eyebrow, but extended his hand. Bella hesitated before finally handing it over, her small fingers trembling as she released it. Carson unfolded the note carefully, his eyes scanning the words written in hurried, desperate handwriting. The room seemed to shrink as he read the first line. "Carson, if you're reading this, I have no one else to turn to." The rest of the letter blurred as his mind raced. Who could this woman be? Why would she send her daughter to him? The name signed at the bottom of the note finally registered, and Carson's breath caught. Celine. A name he hadn't thought of in years. A name tied to memories he'd buried deep. The name hit Carson like a tidal wave, crashing over him with the force of years long past. Celine. He hadn't heard it spoken, hadn't let himself think of it, in over 2 decades. His hand gripped the note tightly as he read the next line, his eyes narrowing with each word. "I wouldn't have sent Bella If I had any other choice. I'm sick, Carson. She needs you. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. He glanced up at Bella, who was now nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her drenched sneakers squeaking softly against the rug. She looked so small, so fragile, but her eyes, there was something undeniably familiar in them. Something that tugged at a place he'd long thought numb. "Your mum, Celine, she sent you here?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. Bella nodded, her grip tightening on the hem of her jacket. "She told me to find you. She said you'd know what to do." Carson ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This was too much, too fast. The last time he'd seen Celine, they'd been young, reckless, and full of dreams they were too scared to chase together. He had left convincing himself it was for the best, that she'd move on and find someone better. He hadn't looked back, and now she was reaching out to him, through a child. I need to understand what's going on," he said, more to himself than to Bella. "Is your mom okay? What kind of sickness?" Bella hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "She said she's tired all the time, and she goes to the hospital a lot. She doesn't talk about it much, but she cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking." The quiet admission sliced through Carson's defenses like a blade. He wasn't ready for this, for the weight of someone else's pain suddenly thrust into his hands. But it wasn't just anyone's pain, was it? It was Celine's. "I see," he said finally, though his mind was anything but clear. He stood and rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze drifting toward the rain-slicked windows. The storm outside seemed less chaotic than the storm brewing in his chest. "Mr. Miller," Ellis said as she returned with a folded towel and a steaming bowl of soup. Her voice was calm, but her sharp eyes darted between Carson and Bella, no doubt piecing together some of what was unfolding. "I made something warm for her. The poor thing looks half-starved." Bella glanced at the bowl, but didn't move until Carson gestured toward it. "Go on," he said softly. "Eat. You look like you need it." She hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the chair Ellis had pulled up for her. She picked up the spoon with trembling hands, her movements careful, as though she wasn't used to having a proper meal in front of her. Carson watched in silence, his thoughts a whirlwind. What did Celine expect him to do? He had no idea how to be a father, if that's even what she was implying. And yet, as he looked at Bella, at her tired eyes and quiet resolve, he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed Celine this much. Maybe more. "She'll need a place to sleep tonight," Ellis said, breaking the silence. "I'll set up the guest room." Carson nodded absently, still staring at Bella. "Thank you." Ellis paused, her gaze softening as she watched him. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "it seems like this little one has been through more than most her age. Maybe it's not just her who needs help. Maybe it's time you faced whatever it is you've been running from." Carson didn't reply, but her words sank deeper than he cared to admit. As Bella finished her soup and Ellis led her upstairs to get cleaned up, Carson unfolded the letter once more. The last line caught his eye, and it felt like a hand gripping his chest. "I know you didn't stay, Carson, but please don't turn your back on her." The words lingered long after the paper was folded back into his pocket. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he made a silent decision. Whatever this was, whatever Celine needed him to do, he would figure it out. Not for himself, not even for her, for Bella. The morning light filtered through the thick curtains of Carson's living room, casting muted shadows across the pristine furniture. Carson sat in his leather armchair, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand, but he hadn't taken a single sip. His gaze was fixed on the letter lying on the coffee table, its words etched into his mind like a haunting refrain. Upstairs, he could hear the faint shuffle of Ellis moving about, likely checking on Bella. She had insisted on keeping the girl warm and fed before Carson could decide his next move. For once, he didn't argue. The girl needed help, and Ellis had always been better at handling fragile situations than he was. His phone buzzed on the side table, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Michael. He hesitated before answering. "What is it?" Carson asked, his tone sharper than intended. "Good morning to you too," Michael replied, his voice tinged with dry humor. "I didn't expect to hear from you this early. I wanted to check if you've seen the latest projections. The numbers from the European division are worse than we thought." Carson pinched the bridge of his nose, already feeling the weight of the conversation. "We'll deal with it. Right now, I've got something else to handle." Michael paused. "Something else? You're not usually the type to push business aside, Carson." Carson glanced at the letter again, his jaw tightening. "It's personal. I'll call you later." Before Michael could press further, Carson ended the call. Business could wait. For once, something more pressing demanded his attention. The sound of footsteps drew his gaze to the staircase, where Ellis was descending with Bella close behind. The girl looked slightly better after a night of rest, though the oversized sweatshirt she wore, borrowed from Carson's guest closet, made her appear even smaller. "She ate breakfast," Ellis announced, her tone brisk but gentle. "Not much, but enough to keep her going. I think she's ready to talk now." Bella's wide eyes darted between Carson and Ellis, uncertainty written across her face. Carson gestured toward the couch across from him. "Come here, Bella. Let's talk." The girl hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the cushion like she might bolt at any moment. Carson leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees to make himself appear less intimidating. "Your mum?" he began carefully. "She told you to find me. Do you know why?" Bella looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the hem of the sweatshirt. She said, "You're the only one who can help us." "Help with what?" Carson pressed gently, though his heart was already racing. Bella glanced at Ellis, as if searching for reassurance, before finally meeting Carson's gaze. "She's sick. Really sick. She doesn't talk about it, but sometimes she can't get out of bed. She used to sing to me at night, but now she's too tired." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Carson felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He hadn't been there when Celine needed him most. He hadn't been there for Bella at all. "Why didn't she call me herself?" Carson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She said you wouldn't come," Bella whispered, her eyes glistening. "She said you left because you didn't want us." The words hit Carson harder than he expected, and for a moment he couldn't find the right thing to say. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice quieter. "If I had known, things might have been different." Bella looked unconvinced, her small frame tense. Carson couldn't blame her. To her, he was nothing more than a stranger her mother had told her to trust despite her own misgivings. "I want to help," he said after a long pause. "But I need to know everything. Do you know what kind of sickness your mom has?" Bella shook her head. "She didn't tell me. She just said it's something bad. She goes to the hospital a lot, but she won't let me come with her. She says it's too scary." Carson exchanged a glance with Ellis, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "All right," he said, sitting up straighter. "We'll figure it out. For now, you're safe here." Bella looked like she wanted to say more, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, her small shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Carson leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know where to start, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this, not anymore. "Ellis," he said, his tone firm but calm, "find out where Celine's staying. We need to see her. Today." The housekeeper gave a curt nod before disappearing into the kitchen to make a few calls. Carson turned his attention back to Bella, who was now watching him with cautious curiosity. "I'll help your mum," he promised, the words heavier than he expected. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Bella didn't reply immediately. When she finally nodded, it was slight, but it was enough. "Good," Carson said softly, though his mind was already racing with what lay ahead. Carson leaned back in his chair as Ellis disappeared into the kitchen, the quiet hum of her phone call faintly audible. Bella sat across from him, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't looking at him now, her eyes fixed on the edge of the coffee table, as though it might provide her some kind of escape. He cleared his throat, softening his tone. "Bella, while Ellis gets the information, I need you to tell me something else. Why now? Why did your mum decide to send you now, of all times?" Bella hesitated, her fingers curling into the fabric of the sweatshirt she wore. She got worse," she admitted quietly. "She doesn't say it, but I can tell. She's been coughing a lot, and sometimes she can't eat. She said it's getting harder to take care of me. That's why she sent me." The words twisted like a knife in Carson's chest. He wasn't prepared for this, not the weight of responsibility, not the depth of the guilt that was slowly clawing its way to the surface. He had built his life around control, making decisions that benefited his business and his independence. But this was chaos, and it had a name: Bella. Before he could respond, Ellis returned, her expression grim. "She's at St. Vincent's, the public wing." Carson frowned. He knew the hospital well enough. It was underfunded, overcrowded, and struggling to keep up with even basic care for its patients. The thought of Celine, the woman he once loved, lying in one of those drab, cold rooms was enough to send a surge of anger through him. "Did you speak to anyone there?" he asked. Ellis shook her head. "No, but they confirmed her admission. I can call back if you need details." "No," Carson said quickly, standing up. "We'll go. I'll see for myself." Bella's eyes widened, her small voice breaking through the tension. "You'll take me to see her?" Carson hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want to take her. It was the thought of what she might see. Hospitals like St. Vincent's weren't known for their comforting atmosphere. The last thing he wanted was to subject Bella to more fear than she'd already endured. But there was no denying her resolve, the quiet strength in her eyes that reminded him so much of Celine. "Yes," he said finally, his voice firm. "We'll go together." Ellis handed him his coat, her brow furrowed with worry. "Mr. Miller, are you sure this is a good idea? Maybe it's better to—" "I need to do this," Carson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked down at Bella, offering her a small nod. "Go get your shoes, kid. We're leaving in 5 minutes." Bella scrambled to her feet, disappearing down the hallway toward the guest room. As soon as she was out of earshot, Ellis stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You know this isn't just about visiting her, don't you? If Celine's in that hospital, it's because she has nowhere else to go. Whatever this is, it's not going to be simple." "I know," Carson admitted, shrugging on his coat. "But I owe her this. I owe them both." Ellis sighed, her gaze softening. "Just be careful. This isn't like closing a business deal, Carson. There's no easy way out." Carson didn't respond. He didn't have to. Deep down, he knew Ellis was right, but this wasn't about finding an easy way out. It was about facing the mess he had left behind, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. A few minutes later, Bella reappeared, her sneakers slightly too large for her feet, but firmly tied. She looked up at Carson with a mix of nervousness and hope that made his chest tighten again. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, clutching the small backpack Ellis had handed her earlier. Together they stepped out into the crisp air, the city bustling around them as they climbed into Carson's car. The silence was heavy as the driver pulled into traffic, weaving through the streets towards St. Vincent's. Bella sat quietly beside him, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack. Carson watched her out of the corner of his eye, wondering how someone so small could carry so much weight on her shoulders. He wanted to say something, to fill the silence with reassurances he wasn't sure he could keep. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked out the window, the skyline of New York blurring as the car sped toward a past he had tried so hard to leave behind. Whatever waited for him at St. Vincent's, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The scent of antiseptic hit Carson the moment he stepped through the automatic doors of St. Vincent's Hospital. The fluorescent lighting cast a harsh glow over the peeling walls, and the faint hum of machinery was interrupted by the occasional cough or muted conversation. Bella clutched his hand tightly as they walked through the crowded hallway, her small fingers trembling against his palm. Carson scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, the rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs, the exhausted faces of patients waiting their turn, and the overworked nurses darting between rooms. He didn't belong here, not in his tailored coat and polished shoes, and he knew it. But this wasn't about him. It was about Celine. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm as he approached the reception desk. A young woman with tired eyes glanced up, barely masking her irritation. "Yes?" she asked, her fingers still typing on the keyboard in front of her. "I'm looking for Celine." "Celine Hargrave," Carson said, hesitating for a brief moment as he spoke her name aloud. "She was admitted recently." The receptionist sighed, scrolling through her screen. "Relationship." Carson hesitated. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. Was he her ex? A distant memory? Or something more complicated now? "Family," he answered finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. He wasn't sure if it was the right answer, but it felt like the only one that mattered. The receptionist nodded, either too busy or too indifferent to question him further. "Room 214, second floor to the left." "Thank you," Carson muttered before turning to Bella. "Come on, kid." The elevator ride to the second floor was silent, save for the faint creak of the old machinery. Bella stayed close to Carson's side, her eyes wide, as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. When the doors slid open, Carson led her down the hallway, his steps growing heavier with each one. Room 214 was at the far end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Carson could see a glimpse of the woman inside. She was lying in the hospital bed, her frame fragile against the stark white sheets. Her once vivid auburn hair was dull and thinning, and her complexion was pale, almost ghostly. He hesitated, his hand hovering just above the door handle. Memories flooded his mind, memories of her laughter, her fiery spirit, the way she used to challenge him in ways no one else ever had. She didn't look like the woman he remembered. She looked like a stranger. "Carson," Bella whispered, tugging at his sleeve. Her voice brought him back to the present. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Celine's head turned at the sound, her eyes narrowing as she registered who was standing in her doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. "You came," Celine said finally, her voice weak but laced with something that sounded almost like disbelief. Carson swallowed hard, stepping closer. "You didn't give me much of a choice." Celine's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "You always needed a push." Bella, still clutching Carson's hand, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mum, I brought him like you said." Celine's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter, the sharp edges of her expression melting into something gentler. "I know, sweetheart. You did good." Carson felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the interaction, a pang of guilt cutting through him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Celine shouldn't have had to rely on an 8-year-old to do what he should have done years ago. "I need to know what's going on," Carson said, his voice low but steady. "Why didn't you call me yourself?" Celine sighed, leaning back against the pillows. "Because I didn't think you'd come. And because I wasn't sure if I wanted you to." Her honesty stung, but Carson couldn't argue with it. He had left her once, and he couldn't blame her for doubting him now. "I'm here," he said after a long pause. "What do you need from me?" Celine's eyes flickered with something unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion, resentment, and perhaps a trace of relief. She exhaled slowly, shifting her gaze to Bella, who had settled into a chair by the bed. "It's not about me," Celine said quietly. "It's about her. I can't take care of her anymore, Carson." The words hung in the air like a lead weight, and Carson felt his chest tighten. He glanced at Bella, who was busy fidgeting with the hem of her sweatshirt, pretending not to hear. But he knew she did. Children always did. "What's wrong, Celine?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "What's going on?" Celine hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Lymphoma," she admitted, the word heavy and final. "It's advanced. They've been trying treatments, but it's not working." Carson felt the room tilt for a moment, the gravity of her words pulling at him. Lymphoma. He didn't know much about it, but he didn't need a medical degree to understand what advanced meant. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice tight. Celine shook her head. "Bad enough. They've done what they can, but I'm running out of time. And Bella..." Her voice broke, and she turned her head away, as if ashamed of her own helplessness. "She needs someone. I can't leave her with no one, Carson. I won't." Carson clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was being too fatalistic, that there had to be another option. But the look in her eyes told him she had already faced the truth, long before he had even known there was a problem. "She has you," Celine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whether you like it or not, Carson, you're her father, and she deserves better than the life I've been able to give her." The word father struck him like a physical blow. He had always been so careful to avoid the ties that bound, to keep his life uncomplicated and free of responsibility beyond his work. But now, here it was, undeniable and inescapable. Bella looked up then, her wide eyes meeting his with a mixture of hope and fear. "Is it true?" she asked softly. "Are you really my dad?" Carson froze, the words catching in his throat. He didn't know how to answer her, how to explain 20 years of mistakes and regrets in a way an 8-year-old could understand. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. "I am." Bella stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not she believed him. Then, slowly, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Celine closed her eyes, her face pale and drawn. "You can hate me for not telling you sooner," she said, her voice barely audible. "But don't take it out on her. She's a good kid, Carson. She just needs a chance." Carson nodded, though his mind was still reeling. He glanced at Bella again, taking in the way she sat so quietly, her hands folded in her lap, like she was afraid to take up too much space. This wasn't what he had planned. None of it was. But maybe that didn't matter anymore. "You don't have to worry," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll take care of her, Celine. Whatever happens, she'll be safe." Celine opened her eyes. a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's all I needed to hear." Carson didn't reply. He didn't trust himself to. Instead, he reached out, placing a hand gently on Bella's shoulder. She looked up at him, her expression cautious but hopeful, and for the first time, Carson felt the faintest stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. Responsibility, purpose, maybe even belonging. As the silence stretched on, the faint hum of hospital machinery filled the room, a reminder that time wasn't on their side. Carson knew this was just the beginning. Of what? He wasn't sure. But as he looked at Bella, at Celine, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away this time. Carson stared out of the rain-streaked window of the car as it rolled through the busy streets of Manhattan. The city moved on around him, yellow cabs honking, pedestrians clutching umbrellas, the distant hum of life continuing uninterrupted. But inside the car, the silence was suffocating. Bella sat beside him, her small frame pressed into the seat. She clutched her backpack tightly, her face unreadable. Carson wanted to say something, to fill the void with reassurances or promises, but every time he opened his mouth, the words felt hollow. What could he possibly say to fix years of absence? To explain why he hadn't been there? Instead, he let the silence stretch, focusing his thoughts on the next step. Celine's revelation had left him reeling, but there was no time to process it. He needed answers, a plan. He needed to know exactly what he was dealing with. "We'll figure this out," Carson said finally, breaking the silence. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, calm but strained. Bella turned her head slightly, her wide eyes searching his face for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "Figure what out?" she asked quietly. "Everything," Carson replied, though the word felt impossibly large. "Your mum's treatment. What happens next? All of it." Bella didn't respond, her gaze dropping to her hands. She traced the edge of her backpack with her fingers, her movements slow and deliberate. "She's really sick, isn't she?" Carson exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah," he admitted. "She is." The car pulled up in front of his townhouse, and the driver stepped out to open the door. Carson gestured for Bella to follow, and together they climbed the stone steps leading to the front door. The house was too big, too quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the hospital. Inside, Ellis was waiting, her sharp eyes immediately scanning Carson's face. "How is she?" she asked, her voice low. "She's not good," Carson replied, his tone clipped. He didn't elaborate, and Ellis didn't push. She turned her attention to Bella instead, offering her a small smile. "Why don't you come with me, sweetheart? We'll get you something to eat," Ellis said gently. Bella hesitated, glancing up at Carson as if seeking permission. He gave her a small nod, and she followed Ellis toward the kitchen, her footsteps barely audible against the hardwood floor. As soon as they were out of earshot, Carson dropped into one of the armchairs in the living room, his head falling into his hands. His mind raced with questions, with memories he'd long tried to forget. The name Celine was like a ghost, haunting the corners of his thoughts. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Dr. Sarah Thompson, the physician Celine had mentioned during their conversation. If anyone could give him the answers he needed, it would be her. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button and waited. "Dr. Thompson speaking," came the professional but kind voice on the other end. "This is Carson Miller," he said, leaning back into the chair. "I'm calling about Celine Hargrave. She's in your care." There was a pause, followed by the sound of papers shuffling. "Yes, Mr. Miller, I remember meeting her. What can I do for you?" "I need to know everything," Carson said, his tone brooking no argument. What's her prognosis? What are her options? Be honest with me." Dr. Thompson sighed, and Carson could hear the weight of her words before she even spoke. "She's in the late stages of lymphoma. We've tried chemotherapy, but it hasn't been effective. Right now, we're focusing on palliative care to manage her symptoms." Carson's jaw tightened. There has to be something else. An experimental treatment? A specialist? "There are options, Doctor," Thompson admitted carefully, "but they're risky and costly." "Money isn't the issue," Carson said sharply. "If there's even a chance, I want to know about it." Dr. Thompson hesitated. "I can send you the details, but you need to understand, this isn't just about the treatment. It's about her quality of life. These options might extend her time, but they won't cure her." "I don't care about the odds," Carson replied firmly. "Send me everything." "Very well, Doctor," Thompson said, her tone softening. "I'll email the information to you. And Mr. Miller? Celine's going to need support, both medical and emotional." Carson ended the call without replying. He already knew that much. The question was whether he was ready to provide it. Carson placed the phone down slowly, the weight of Dr. Thompson's words pressing heavily on his chest. Late stages, palliative care, quality of life. None of it sounded hopeful, and the thought of Celine facing this alone twisted something deep inside him. He rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. There had to be a way to make this right, not just for her, but for Bella too. The sound of soft footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see Bella standing hesitantly in the doorway. She had a sandwich in her hands, untouched, her eyes filled with questions she was too afraid to ask. "Hey," Carson said, his voice softer than he intended. "You okay?" Bella nodded, though her expression said otherwise. She stepped into the room, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized sweatshirt and the cavernous space of the living room. She looked down at the sandwich, then back at Carson. "Ellis said I should eat," she said quietly. "But I'm not hungry." Carson gestured for her to sit on the couch across from him, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. She placed the sandwich on the coffee table, her hands folding nervously in her lap. "Is Mom going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Carson harder than he expected. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he searched for the right words. He couldn't lie to her, not when she was already carrying so much. But the truth was a jagged edge, one he didn't know how to soften. "She's really sick," he said carefully, meeting Bella's gaze. "But we're going to do everything we can to help her. Okay?" Bella studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "She's been sick for a long time," she said finally, "but she always tried to hide it. She didn't want me to know." Carson nodded slowly, the image of Celine's pale, fragile figure still vivid in his mind. "She loves you," he said. "She's been doing everything she can to take care of you." Bella's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "She always says it's just us, that we don't need anyone else. But then she sent me to you." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "Why didn't you come before?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Carson swallowed hard, guilt rising like a wave he couldn't hold back. How could he explain to an 8-year-old the choices he'd made, the fear and selfishness that had kept him away? "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "If I had, I would have been there." Bella looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or reassurance. "Do you think she forgives you?" Carson hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to try to make things right, for her, and for you." The words felt like a promise, one he wasn't entirely sure he could keep. But as Bella nodded, her small shoulders relaxing just slightly, he knew he had to try. Ellis appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice low. "You have an email. I think it's from the doctor." Carson stood, his heart heavy but resolute. "Thank you, Ellis. Bella, why don't you stay here with Ellis for a bit? I need to look at something." Bella nodded silently, her gaze following him as he walked toward his study. Once inside, Carson opened his laptop, the glow of the screen casting a harsh light on his face as he pulled up the email from Dr. Thompson. Attached were files detailing experimental treatments, clinical trials, and a list of specialists who might be able to help. He scanned the documents, his mind racing. The treatments were risky, the odds slim, but they were something. And if there was even a chance, no matter how small, he owed it to Celine to try. But the cost, it wasn't just financial. It was emotional, personal. It would mean committing to something he'd avoided his entire life, responsibility. For Celine, for Bella, for the family he'd left behind. Carson leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He glanced at the photo frame on his desk, one he hadn't touched in years. It held an old picture of him and Celine, taken in a different time, a different life. She was laughing, her eyes alight with mischief, and he was looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. Maybe it was time to stop running from that memory, time to stop running from her. With a deep breath, Carson reached for his phone and dialed Dr. Thompson's number. The line rang twice before she picked up. "This is Carson Miller," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Let's move forward with the treatments, whatever it takes." The decision was made. And for the first time in years, Carson felt a flicker of purpose, fragile but undeniable. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't turning back. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Carson's townhouse, illuminating the quiet tension that had settled over the living room. Bella sat at the dining table, her legs swinging idly as she pushed her cereal around the bowl with a spoon. She wasn't eating much, but Carson didn't press her. He wasn't sure what to say to her or to himself after the whirlwind of revelations from the day before. Ellis moved efficiently through the room, tidying up and occasionally glancing at Carson with an expression that spoke volumes. He ignored her for the moment, his attention focused on the email he had pulled up on his phone. It was from Dr. Thompson, detailing the steps needed to begin Celine's treatment. There were forms to fill out, arrangements to make, and financial commitments that would stretch even his considerable resources. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that it gave Celine a fighting chance. Carson rubbed his temples, the weight of everything bearing down on him. "Ellis," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I need you to stay with Bella today. I have some things to take care of." Ellis straightened, folding the dish towel over her arm. "Of course," she said, her tone brisk. "Where are you going?" "To the hospital," Carson replied, pocketing his phone. "I need to talk to Dr. Thompson, and then I need to meet with my legal team." Ellis arched an eyebrow. "Your legal team?" "There are going to be custody arrangements," Carson said, his voice firmer than he felt. "If something happens to Celine, I need to be ready." Ellis didn't respond immediately, but the look in her eyes softened. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly, "for Bella and for her mother." Carson nodded, though the reassurance felt hollow. He looked at Bella, who was now staring out the window, her spoon abandoned in the bowl. "Hey, kid," he said gently. "I'm going to check on your mom. Ellis will stay with you while I'm gone, okay?" Bella turned to him, her expression guarded. "Will you tell her I said hi?" Of course, Carson said, managing a small smile. Anything else you want me to tell her? Bella shook her head, her eyes dropping to her lap. Just tell her I miss her. Carson's chest tightened at her words, but he nodded. I'll tell her. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting against his skin. The driver was already waiting, and Carson climbed into the back seat, his mind racing as the car pulled away from the curb. The streets of Manhattan blurred past the window, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed with the conversation he was about to have with Dr. Thompson, and the reality of what it meant for his life going forward. When the car arrived at St. Vincent's, Carson stepped out, his shoulders squaring as he walked through the hospital doors. The sterile smell hit him again, bringing back memories of the day before. He made his way to the second floor, stopping briefly at the nurse's station to confirm that Dr. Thompson was available. A nurse directed him to an office down the hall, and Carson knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. Dr. Thompson looked up from her desk, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Miller," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming in." "Thanks for making time," Carson replied, taking the seat she gestured to. "I wanted to discuss the next steps for Celine's treatment. I've reviewed the options you sent me." Dr. Thompson nodded, pulling up a file on her computer. "We're looking at an aggressive combination therapy. It's experimental, which means there are risks involved, but it's her best chance at extending her time." "How soon can we start?" Carson asked, his tone clipped. "As soon as we have the paperwork in order," Dr. Thompson said. "But, Mr. Miller, I need you to understand something. Even with this treatment, the odds aren't in her favor. There's no guarantee." "I know," Carson said, his jaw tightening. "But I'm not giving up on her." Dr. Thompson studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have the team prepare everything. In the meantime, you should talk to her about what this treatment will entail. She needs to be fully informed." Carson exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'll handle it." As he left the office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Michael, his business partner, asking for an update on a pending deal. Carson ignored it. His priorities had shifted, and for the first time in his life, business wasn't at the top of the list. Carson made his way back to Celine's room, his steps steady, but his thoughts turbulent. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway seemed colder now, the weight of the decision he'd just made settling over him. When he reached room 214, he paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He wasn't just walking into a conversation. He was walking into a promise, one that would alter the course of all their lives. Pushing the door open, he found Celine sitting up slightly, her frail form propped against the pillows. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and exhaustion, her eyes shadowed but still sharp. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with the faintest trace of humor. "I wanted to talk to you about the treatment," Carson replied, pulling up a chair beside the bed. He hesitated for a moment before sitting, his gaze steady on hers. "Dr. Thompson and I discussed the options. She says there's a chance. Small, but it's there." Celine's lips pressed into a thin line. "A chance at what? A few more months? More time to feel like this?" She gestured weakly at the IV line running into her arm. "It's not just about you," Carson said firmly, leaning forward. "It's about Bella. She needs you, Celine. And if there's even the slightest possibility that this could work, we have to try." Celine turned her head away, staring out the window. For a moment Carson thought she might argue, but when she spoke, her voice was resigned. "Do you think I haven't thought about that? About her? Everything I've done, everything I've endured has been for her. But Carson, I'm tired, and I don't know if I can keep fighting." "You don't have to do it alone," Carson said, his tone softer now. "I'm here, I'll handle the costs, the logistics, everything. All you need to do is focus on getting better." She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. "Why now?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and bitterness. "Why, after all this time?" Carson hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "Because I made a mistake," he said finally, "and I don't want to make another one, not with you, not with her." Celine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she nodded, though her movements were slow, as if the decision had sapped what little strength she had left. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll do it." For Bella relief washed over Carson, though he kept his emotions in check. "Good," he said. "Dr. Thompson will get everything ready. We'll start as soon as possible." Celine closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a shaky breath. "You'll stay with her, won't you? If something happens to me, you'll take care of her." Carson reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You don't have to worry about that," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Celine didn't reply, but the faintest trace of a smile curved her lips before she let her head rest back against the pillows. As Carson stood to leave, he glanced down at her, the weight of her vulnerability striking him anew. She was still the fierce, passionate woman he remembered, but now there was a fragility to her, a fragility he felt fiercely protective of. Outside the room, Carson paused to gather himself. The conversation had gone better than he expected, but he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there were no guarantees. But for Bella, for Celine, he was willing to take that risk. As he stepped back into the bustling hallway, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Michael calling. Reluctantly, Carson answered. "What is it, Michael?" he asked. His tone clipped. "We've got a problem," Michael replied, his voice tense. "Francois is moving forward with his plans to cut you out of the deal. If we don't act fast, we could lose control of the company." Carson's jaw tightened, a new wave of tension settling over him. "Handle it," he said curtly. "I'll deal with it when I get back." "Carson, this isn't something you can push aside," Michael pressed. "If you don't—" "I said I'll handle it," Carson interrupted, his voice steely. "Right now, there are more important things." He ended the call before Michael could respond, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Business could wait. For the first time in his life, it wasn't the priority. Family was. As he headed for the exit, Carson felt a strange sense of clarity. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time in years, he knew what he was fighting for, and he wasn't about to let anyone or anything stand in his way. The steady hum of activity outside the townhouse was a stark contrast to the tense quiet that filled its interior. Carson stood near the window, phone in hand, staring blankly at the screen. The text from Michael was short and to the point. "Francois is meeting with the board tomorrow. Call me ASAP." But Carson hadn't called back. Not yet. His priorities were elsewhere, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't ashamed to admit that. He glanced over his shoulder at Bella, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the living room, sorting through a stack of coloured pencils Ellis had found for her. She was quiet, focused, her small fingers carefully arranging the colours in neat rows. The sight brought a faint, fleeting smile to Carson's face, one that quickly faded as his thoughts turned back to the storm brewing on every front. Ellis appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "You've been pacing for half an hour," she said, her tone more observation than reprimand. "Whatever it is, you need to deal with it." Carson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's Francois. He's pushing harder than I expected. If he gets enough of the board on his side, I could lose control of the company." Ellis raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "And what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," Carson admitted, his voice low. Michael's handling the immediate fallout, but if I step in now, it'll mean pulling focus from everything else. Ellis crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. You're trying to do two impossible things at once, Carson. You can't fight a corporate war and save a family at the same time. Carson's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. I can't lose either. Ellis opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sharp buzz of the intercom interrupted her. She glanced at Carson, who moved quickly to the panel near the door. Yes? He said into the speaker. Delivery for Mr. Miller, came the voice on the other end. Carson frowned but pressed the button to unlock the gate. A moment later, a courier appeared at the door, holding a flat, slim package. Carson signed for it, his brow furrowing as he read the label. It was from Rebecca, his PR manager, a name he hadn't expected to see so soon. What's that? Ellis asked as Carson closed the door. Something from Rebecca, he replied, carefully unsealing the package. Inside was a folder filled with documents, along with a handwritten note on top. Carson. This is the media briefing we discussed. I thought you'd want to see the narrative Francois is feeding to the press. It's already circulating. Rebecca Carson's stomach dropped as he flipped through the pages. Francois hadn't just been targeting the board, he was going after Carson's public image, spinning a tale of corporate mismanagement and personal neglect. Every detail was crafted to paint Carson as an absentee leader, someone who prioritized his own interests over the company's well-being. What is it? Ellis asked again, her tone more insistent this time. It's Francois, Carson said, his voice tight. He's leaking stories to the press, trying to undermine me before tomorrow's meeting. Ellis shook her head, a note of anger in her expression. You can't let him get away with this. I won't, Carson said, snapping the folder shut. But as he looked across the room at Bella, who was now carefully drawing on a sheet of paper, he felt the weight of his next decision pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to fight back, to throw everything he had at Francois and reclaim control. But doing so meant stepping away, from Bella, from Celine, from the fragile foundation he was only just beginning to rebuild. Carson closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He needed to think, to strategize, but more than anything, he needed to figure out how to hold everything together without losing the people who mattered most. Carson set the folder down on the coffee table, his fingers drumming against its surface as he wrestled with the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The stakes had never felt higher, and the pull between his obligations was tearing at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Across the room, Bella looked up from her drawing, her curious eyes studying him for a moment before returning to her work. He knew he couldn't let Francois's narrative go unchallenged. If the public turned against him, it wouldn't just jeopardize his position, it could destabilize the entire company. The livelihoods of thousands of employees depended on him holding the line. Yet every second he spent on this fight felt like a second stolen from Celine and Bella. Ellis's voice broke through his thoughts. You need to get ahead of this, she said firmly, nodding toward the folder. If Francois is feeding stories to the press, you need to counter them before they take root. I know, Carson muttered, standing abruptly. But I can't leave Bella and Celine right now. If I show up at the office or even make a public statement, it sends a signal that I'm prioritizing the company over them. Ellis's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. Then delegate. You've got people you trust. Rebecca, Michael. Let them do their jobs. Carson turned to her, his expression skeptical. And what happens when Francois escalates? This isn't just about perception, Ellis. He's going for the board. If they lose confidence in me, it's over. Then make them see the truth, Ellis shot back. You're not just a businessman, Carson. You're a father now, whether you're ready for it or not. Show them the man you're trying to be, not the man Francois is painting you as. Carson stared at her, the words sinking deeper than he cared to admit. He hated how right she was. For years, he had built a reputation on control, on projecting an image of strength and competence. Letting people see his vulnerability felt like walking into a fight unarmed. But maybe that was the only way to win this one. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Rebecca's number. The call connected after 2 rings. "Carson," Rebecca's voice came through, brisk and professional. "I was just about to follow up on the package I sent." "I saw it," Carson replied, pacing the room. "Francois is going all in, isn't he?" "Absolutely," Rebecca said. "He's banking on you staying silent. If you don't push back, the narrative becomes truth. But I need to know what you want to do." Carson glanced at Bella, who was now focused intently on her drawing, the tip of her tongue peeking out as she concentrated. "We need to counter it," he said after a pause, "but it has to come from the right place. This isn't just about numbers or leadership. It's personal." Rebecca's voice softened slightly. "I understand. I can draft something that balances both, something that shows the board and the public that you're still in control, but that you're human too. Do you want to review it before it goes out?" "No," Carson said, his tone resolute. "I trust you. Just make sure it hits hard enough to put Francois on his heels." "Understood," Rebecca replied. "I'll have it out by this evening." As the call ended, Carson set his phone down, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, he had let someone else take the reins, and while it unsettled him, it also brought a strange sense of relief. Ellis gave him a small nod of approval before heading back to the kitchen. Carson walked over to Bella, who was now holding up her drawing with a proud smile. It was a colourful sketch of 3 figures standing together, a man, a woman, and a little girl. "Is that us?" Carson asked, his voice softening as he crouched down beside her. Bella nodded, her grin widening. "Mum says we're supposed to stick together, like a family." Carson felt his chest tighten, but he smiled back at her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Your mom's right. We are." For the first time that day, Carson felt a flicker of clarity. He didn't need to choose between the company and his family. He just needed to fight for both, and trust that somehow he would find the strength to do it. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Carson stepped into the small conference room at St. Vincent's. Dr. Sarah Thompson was already there, seated at the far end of the table with a stack of medical files in front of her. She glanced up as he entered, offering a faint smile of acknowledgement, though her expression remained serious. "Mr. Miller," she greeted, motioning for him to take the seat across from her. "Thank you for meeting with me." Carson nodded, lowering himself into the chair. "I need to know everything," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Not just about the treatment, about the risks, the costs, what happens if it doesn't work. I want the full picture." Dr. Thompson folded her hands over the file, her gaze steady. "As I mentioned before, we're looking at an aggressive combination therapy. It's experimental, and while there have been cases of success, it's not without significant risks. Celine's condition is advanced, and the treatment will be hard on her, physically and emotionally." "And the costs?" Carson pressed, though he already knew the answer wouldn't matter. "They're high," Dr. Thompson admitted. "We're looking at tens of thousands of dollars per cycle, not including the potential for additional procedures or extended care. Insurance might cover a portion, but not all of it." Carson leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. The financial aspect was the least of his concerns. What mattered more were the odds and the toll it would take on Celine. "What's her take on this?" he asked after a moment. "Does she want to go through with it?" Dr. Thompson hesitated. She's conflicted. She knows this treatment could give her more time, but she's also aware of the toll it could take on her body. And frankly, she's worried about Bella. She doesn't want her daughter to see her suffering more than she already has. Carson exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had seen the pain in Celine's eyes, the quiet resignation that came from years of fighting alone. But he also knew that walking away from this fight wasn't an option, for her or for Bella. "She won't be alone," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, I'll make sure she has what she needs. And Bella, she'll be taken care of." Dr. Thompson nodded, her expression softening. "That's good to hear. Celine will need all the support she can get. I'll make the arrangements to begin the treatment as soon as possible." "Thank you," Carson said, standing. He extended a hand, and Dr. Thompson shook it, her grip firm despite the gravity of the situation. As Carson left the conference room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from Rebecca. "Statement released. Positive response so far. Call me when you're free." For a brief moment, relief washed over him. The chaos with Francois wasn't resolved, but at least the narrative was shifting in his favor. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and made his way toward Celine's room, determined to share the plan with her, and to show her that this time she wasn't facing it alone. When Carson reached Celine's room, he paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself. This wasn't just about discussing treatment plans or logistics. It was about convincing her to hold on, to fight, when she had every reason to give up. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside with a quiet determination. Celine was sitting up in bed, her face pale but alert. Bella was perched on the edge of the chair beside her, swinging her legs as she colored in a notebook Carson didn't recognize. The sight of them together, so small against the sterile backdrop of the hospital room, tugged at something deep in his chest. "You're back," Celine said, her voice soft but tinged with surprise. Carson nodded, closing the door behind him. "I just spoke with Dr. Thompson. The treatment's ready to go as soon as you're ready." Celine's eyes flickered, a mix of emotions crossing her face: relief, fear, and something that looked dangerously close to defeat. "And if I'm not ready?" she asked, her tone quiet but pointed. Bella looked up, her eyes darting between them. "What does that mean, Mom?" she asked, her small voice breaking the tension. Carson crouched down beside her chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "It means your mum has a big decision to make," he said gently, glancing at Celine. "And we're here to help her." Celine's gaze softened as she looked at Bella, her defenses crumbling just slightly. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Sweetheart, why don't you go with Ellis for a bit? I need to talk to Carson." Bella frowned but nodded, slipping off the chair and gathering her notebook. As she left the room, Carson straightened, his focus shifting entirely to Celine. "Talk to me," he said, pulling the chair closer to her bedside. "What's holding you back?" Celine let out a slow breath, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "It's not just the treatment," she admitted. "It's everything. The idea of going through this, of putting Bella through it. I don't know if it's the right thing to do." "She wants you to fight," Carson said, his voice steady. "She needs you, and whether you believe it or not, you're stronger than you think." Celine shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I've been strong for so long, Carson. I'm tired. And the thought of her watching me suffer through this, I don't want that to be the last thing she remembers of me." Carson leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "Then don't let it be. Show her what it means to fight for something. Show her that even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, you don't give up. She's watching you, Celine, and she's learning what it means to be brave." Celine looked at him, her tears finally spilling over. "You make it sound so easy," she whispered. It's not, Carson admitted, but you don't have to do it alone. You have Bella, you have me, and I'm not going anywhere. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Finally, Celine nodded, her resolve flickering to life. Okay, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Let's do it. Carson exhaled, relief flooding through him. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll get through this, he promised. Together. Celine nodded again, her grip tightening slightly around his hand. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it. The late afternoon sun filtered through the bare branches of Central Park, casting long shadows across the paved pathways. Carson walked beside Bella, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat as the crisp autumn air nipped at his skin. Bella held onto a paper bag tightly, her small hand occasionally brushing against his as they strolled in companionable silence. The park was alive with activity despite the chill. Joggers moving in rhythmic strides, children chasing each other around a play structure, couples bundled in scarves sharing quiet conversations. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, muted world of the hospital they had left behind just hours earlier. Bella glanced up at him, her wide eyes curious. Do you come here a lot? She asked, breaking the silence. Carson shook his head. Not as much as I used to, he admitted. I've been busy. She nodded, as though she understood, though Carson suspected she didn't fully grasp what busy meant in his world. He wondered if she thought it was a choice, his absence, rather than the result of a life spent chasing success at all costs. Bella slowed her pace as they approached a small pond where ducks floated lazily on the water's surface. She crouched down, opening the paper bag to reveal small bits of bread. Can I feed them? She asked, looking up at Carson. Of course, he said, kneeling beside her. Just don't throw too much at once, or they'll fight over it. Bella grinned, tossing a small piece of bread into the water. Almost immediately, 2 ducks paddled toward it, quacking loudly as they vied for the morsel. She giggled, the sound light and carefree, a rare moment of joy that Carson hadn't realized he needed to hear. They're funny, Bella said, tossing another piece. Mom used to take me to feed ducks back home, but we didn't do it much after she got sick. Carson watched her, his chest tightening at the mention of Celine. Do you miss it? He asked gently. Sometimes, Bella said, her voice quiet. I miss a lot of things, but I guess it's okay. Mum says things change, and we have to be okay with that. Carson nodded, though her words hit harder than he expected. He had spent most of his life resisting change, building walls to protect himself from anything that threatened his carefully constructed world. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of a park with a daughter he was only just beginning to know, trying to piece together a life he had walked away from. You're a smart kid, he said after a moment. Your mum's right. Things do change, but that doesn't mean we can't make new memories. Bella looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. Like feeding ducks. Exactly, Carson said with a small smile. Or maybe something bigger. What else do you want to do while you're here? Bella thought for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know. Maybe ice skating. Mum said she used to go skating when she was little, but I've never tried. Carson nodded, filing the idea away for later. We'll make it happen, he promised. Bella's eyes lit up, and for a moment the weight she carried seemed to lift. As they continued feeding the ducks, Carson couldn't help but feel that he was building something. Not just memories, but a connection he hadn't realized he was missing. As the bag of bread emptied, Bella stood, brushing crumbs from her hands onto her jeans. The cold breeze carried the faint laughter of children from a nearby carousel, and she turned toward the sound, her eyes widening with curiosity. Can we go there? she asked, pointing at the brightly lit ride spinning in lazy circles. Carson followed her gaze, the carousel a vibrant splash of color against the muted tones of the autumn park. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sure, let's check it out. Bella's face lit up with excitement, and she grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the attraction. Carson couldn't remember the last time someone had held his hand like this, so trusting, so full of unspoken hope. The sensation was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. As they approached the carousel, Bella's enthusiasm grew. She looked up at the painted horses, her fingers tightening around Carson's as if afraid he might change his mind. "Pick anyone you want," he said, pulling out his wallet and handing the attendant cash for a ticket. Bella stepped onto the platform, her eyes darting between the rows of brightly painted animals. After a moment, she chose a white horse with a golden mane, climbing onto the saddle with Carson's help. She settled in, her small hands gripping the pole tightly as the carousel began to move. Carson stepped back, watching as the ride came to life. Bella's laughter rang out as the horse rose and fell with the rhythm of the music, her smile wide and unguarded. For a fleeting moment, she looked like any other child, carefree and untouched by the weight of the world. He leaned against the railing, his mind drifting. This was what he had been missing, he realized, not just with Bella, but with life in general. Moments like these, small and simple but undeniably meaningful. He had spent so long chasing success, building walls to keep himself safe, that he hadn't noticed what he was shutting out. And now, standing here, watching Bella's joy, he felt the first cracks in those walls. When the ride ended, Bella ran back to him, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly mussed from the wind. "Did you see me?" she asked, breathless with excitement. "I saw," Carson said, smiling. "You looked like you were having a lot of fun." "I was!" Bella exclaimed, her voice bright. Then her expression softened, and she looked up at him with something deeper in her eyes. "Thanks for bringing me here." Carson crouched to her level, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "This is just the beginning, Bella. We're going to have a lot more days like this." Bella nodded, her smile returning. She reached out and hugged him quickly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Carson froze for a moment, caught off guard by the gesture, but then he hugged her back, holding her close. As they made their way back through the park, the sun dipping lower in the sky, Carson felt something shift within him. He didn't know what the future held. There were too many battles left to fight, too many uncertainties ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something real, for someone real. And as Bella walked beside him, her small hand slipping back into his, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The tension in the conference room was suffocating. Carson sat at the head of the long, polished table, his gaze fixed on François Leclerc, who was seated opposite him with an air of smug confidence. Around the table, members of the board exchanged uncertain glances, clearly caught in the crossfire of the two men's unspoken battle. "I think we can all agree," François began, his smooth voice dripping with false civility, "that the recent challenges facing the company require a steady hand at the helm. A leader who is fully committed and present." Carson's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. François was playing his hand carefully, framing his accusations in vague terms while planting seeds of doubt. It was a calculated move, designed to erode Carson's credibility without making any direct claims. "Commitment has never been an issue for me," Carson said evenly, his voice cutting through the murmurs around the table. "My track record speaks for itself. Under my leadership, this company has seen unprecedented growth." François leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. But at what cost? The press has been less than kind about recent developments. Public perception matters, Carson, and right now it's not in your favor. Carson met his gaze, unflinching. Perception can be managed. What matters is results, and I've delivered those consistently. The room fell silent, the tension mounting as the board members exchanged uneasy looks. It was clear that some of them were swayed by Francois's arguments, though none of them were willing to voice their opinions outright. At that moment, the door to the conference room opened and Rebecca stepped inside, a laptop in hand. She moved with purpose, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as she set the device down in front of Carson. "Sorry to interrupt," she said briskly, glancing pointedly at Francois before addressing the board. "But I thought you'd all like to see something before this discussion goes any further." Rebecca tapped a few keys, and the screen lit up with a presentation. It displayed graphs and charts outlining the company's recent performance metrics, numbers that told a very different story from the one Francois had been trying to spin. "As you can see," Rebecca continued, her tone crisp and professional, "despite recent challenges, the company remains stable and profitable. Public sentiment may fluctuate, but the fundamentals are strong, thanks to Mr. Miller's leadership." Carson watched as the board members leaned in, studying the data with renewed interest. Even Francois's confident facade seemed to falter slightly as the presentation unfolded. "And one more thing," Rebecca added, pulling up a series of headlines on the screen. "This morning, we launched a strategic media campaign to counter the misinformation circulating in the press. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, with key stakeholders reaffirming their support for Mr. Miller." Francois's smirk vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. Carson allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before leaning forward, his hands resting on the table. "It's easy to spread rumors and cast doubt," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But leadership isn't about playing games or chasing headlines. It's about results, integrity, and the people who depend on us. That's what I bring to this company, and that's what I'll continue to deliver." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the board. One by one the members nodded, their expressions shifting to ones of agreement. Francois shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly realizing that his coup was slipping through his fingers. Rebecca closed the laptop, her confident gaze meeting Carson's. "I think that about covers it," she said with a faint smile. Carson nodded, his attention returning to the board. "Unless anyone has further concerns, I believe this discussion is over." The board members exchanged glances before offering their unanimous support. Francois stood abruptly, his frustration barely concealed, and stormed out of the room without another word. As the door closed behind him, Carson exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. But he knew this was only one battle won in a much larger war. As the board members began to file out of the room, offering polite nods of approval as they passed, Carson stayed seated. He clasped his hands on the table, his mind already turning to the next steps. Rebecca lingered near the door, clearly waiting for him to speak. "You came through," Carson said finally, looking up at her. There was a note of genuine gratitude in his voice, rare but unmistakable. Rebecca offered a small smile, though her tone remained professional. "It's what you hired me for. But don't get too comfortable. Francois isn't the type to give up after one loss." Carson nodded, his expression hardening. "I know. Keep an eye on him. If he tries anything else, I want to know about it before it becomes a problem." "Already on it," Rebecca replied, gathering her things. "And Carson, you handled that well. The board needed to see you fight for this." As she left, Carson leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The room was quiet now, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly ebbing away. but his work wasn't done. Not even close. Francois might have been dealt a setback, but the fallout from his schemes was far from over. Carson's position was secure for now, but it would take more than a single meeting to repair the damage. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Michael stepped in, his expression one of cautious optimism. "I just heard," he said, closing the door behind him. "Rebecca said you shut Francois down pretty thoroughly." "For now," Carson said, standing and stretching his shoulders. "But he's not going anywhere. We need to be ready for whatever he tries next." Michael nodded, stepping closer. "I've already started drafting a plan to reinforce your position with the board. Francois won't have an opening if we stay proactive." "Good," Carson said, appreciating Michael's steady presence. "I'll review it tonight." Michael hesitated, his expression shifting slightly. "There's one more thing," he said carefully. "I know this isn't my place, but how's everything else, with Celine and Bella?" Carson paused, surprised by the question. He wasn't used to mixing his personal life with work, and Michael had always respected that boundary. But there was no avoiding the fact that the two worlds were colliding now. "They're holding on," Carson said finally. "Celine starts treatment soon. Bella's staying with me while we figure everything out." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "If you need anything, personally or professionally, you just have to ask." "Thanks," Carson said, meaning it. "I'll let you know." As Michael left, Carson felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination settle over him. The day's battles were far from over, but as he left the conference room and made his way to the car waiting outside, his focus shifted. The weight of his responsibilities, both as a leader and as a father, was heavier than ever, but so was his resolve. As the car pulled away from the building, Carson glanced out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. He had fought for his company today, and tomorrow he would fight for his family. And this time, he wouldn't lose. The hospital room was dimly lit, the faint hum of machinery the only sound breaking the silence. Carson sat in a chair beside Celine's bed, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched her sleep. The lines of exhaustion etched into her face were sharper now, her once vibrant features softened by the toll of her illness. Despite the frailty, there was a quiet strength in her that Carson couldn't ignore. He had been here for hours, unwilling to leave after the treatment began. The first round had been grueling, more so than even the doctors had warned, and though Celine hadn't complained, Carson could see the toll it was taking on her. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, his mind swirling with guilt and determination. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Thompson stepped inside, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She offered Carson a small nod before approaching the bed. "How is she?" Carson asked, his voice low but steady. Dr. Thompson glanced at the monitors before replying. "She's stable for now. The first round of treatment is always the hardest. Her body's reacting as we expected, fatigue, nausea, general weakness. It's a lot to endure, but she's holding on." Carson exhaled, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. "And the prognosis? Do we have any reason to hope?" Dr. Thompson hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's too early to make predictions. But the fact that she's tolerating the treatment so far is a good sign. What she needs now is rest and support." "You're doing the right thing by being here." Carson nodded, though the reassurance felt fragile. He turned his gaze back to Celine, his thoughts pulling him in a dozen different directions. He wanted to believe in the possibility of recovery, but the uncertainty was a constant weight. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Thompson said, her tone softening, "I've seen patients in similar situations pull through against the odds. A strong support system makes all the difference." Carson looked at her, his jaw tightening. She has that now. She won't face this alone. Dr. Thompson smiled faintly before stepping out of the room, leaving Carson alone with his thoughts once more. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the edge of the bed as he watched Celine stir slightly in her sleep. "I'm here," he murmured, the words barely audible. "I'm not leaving this time." As if sensing his presence, Celine's eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, her gaze meeting his. "Carson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he repeated, sitting up straighter. "How are you feeling?" Celine managed a faint smile. "Like I got hit by a truck," she said, her dry humor intact despite the obvious strain. Carson chuckled softly, though his expression remained serious. "You're tougher than any truck." Celine's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet vulnerability. "I'm scared, Carson," she admitted. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can," Carson said firmly, reaching for her hand. "And you're not doing it alone. Whatever it takes, we'll get through this. Together." Celine looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, the walls she had built around herself crumbled, and she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Together." Carson held her hand tightly, his resolve strengthening. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on, for her, for Bella, and for the future they all deserved. Celine drifted back into a restless sleep not long after, leaving Carson sitting by her bedside, her hand still lightly clasped in his. The quiet rhythm of her breathing filled the room, and he found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and regret. She had always been strong, stronger than he'd realized when they were younger. Now that strength was being tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The door creaked open again, and Carson turned to see Bella peeking inside. She held a small stuffed bear in her arms, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "Can I come in?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Carson nodded, gesturing for her to join him. Bella padded quietly into the room, her sneakers barely making a sound against the tiled floor. She stopped beside him, her eyes fixed on Celine. "Is she okay?" Bella asked, clutching the bear tighter. "She's resting," Carson replied gently. "The treatment was hard on her, but the doctors said she's doing as well as they hoped." Bella's brow furrowed, her gaze not leaving her mother. "She looks so tired," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't like seeing her like this." Carson reached out, resting a hand on Bella's shoulder. "I know it's hard," he said, his tone steady but filled with empathy. "But this is part of getting better. She's fighting, Bella, and she's doing it for you." Bella looked up at him, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want her to be okay." "So do I," Carson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And that's why we're going to do everything we can to help her." Bella nodded slowly, then carefully placed the stuffed bear on the bed beside Celine. "This is Mr. Snuggles," she said, her tone serious. "He's really good at helping when you don't feel good. Mom always gave him to me when I was sick." Carson felt his chest tighten at the gesture, a lump forming in his throat. "I think she'll like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Bella climbed into the chair beside him, curling up with her knees drawn to her chest. Carson wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching over Celine as she slept. Hours later, as the night deepened, Carson's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from Michael. "Francois is making moves again. We need to talk." Carson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He had spent the day fighting for Celine, for Bella, for the fragile foundation they were trying to rebuild as a family. And now, it seemed, the battle with Francois was far from over. But as he looked at Bella, her head resting against his side, and Celine, her chest rising and falling steadily, Carson made a decision. He wouldn't let Francois or anyone else distract him from what truly mattered. Not anymore. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, ignoring the buzz of another incoming message. For now his focus was here, with the two people who needed him most. The battles could wait until tomorrow. Tonight he was exactly where he needed to be. The gala hall buzzed with quiet anticipation, the murmur of conversations mingling with the soft notes of a live string quartet. Carson adjusted his tie, scanning the room as he stood near the entrance. The event was elegant but understated, a fundraiser for St. Vincent's Hospital, organized by Rebecca to counter Francois's attempts to undermine his public image. It was a strategic move, but it also felt deeply personal. Tonight wasn't just about reclaiming his reputation. It was about showing Bella and Celine that he could be someone they could depend on. Rebecca approached, clipboard in hand, her sharp gaze scanning the room with practiced efficiency. "Everything's running smoothly so far," she said, offering a small nod of approval. "The press is here, but they're staying in their designated areas. I've prepped a statement for you to deliver before the auction." Carson nodded, his mind already racing through the words he'd rehearsed. "Thanks, Rebecca. Let's make sure this stays on track. I can't afford any surprises tonight." Rebecca smirked faintly, her confidence unwavering. "You've got this. Just remember, speak from the heart. That's what people want to see." As she walked off to check on the final details, Carson caught sight of Bella entering the hall with Ellis. Dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, Bella looked both nervous and excited, her wide eyes taking in the grandeur of the event. She spotted Carson and broke into a grin, hurrying over to him. "Wow," she said, looking up at him with awe. "This place is huge. Are all these people here for you?" Carson chuckled softly, crouching to meet her gaze. "They're here to support the hospital, and your mom, in a way. But yeah, I guess I have something to do with it." Bella beamed, clutching the small clutch bag Ellis had given her. "Mom said you used to do stuff like this all the time. Were you nervous then too?" "A little," Carson admitted, his voice softening. "But I didn't have you here with me before. That makes it better." Bella's smile grew wider, and she stood on her tiptoes to give him a quick hug. "Mom would be proud," she whispered, and Carson felt his chest tighten at the words. Straightening, he glanced at Ellis, who stood nearby with her usual calm demeanor. "Everything okay?" he asked. Ellis nodded. "Celine wanted me to tell you she's watching from the live stream. She's rooting for you." Carson's heart swelled at the thought. Though Celine couldn't be there in person, knowing she was watching gave him an added sense of purpose. "Thanks, Ellis," he said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure this is a night worth remembering." Rebecca returned moments later, signaling that it was time for Carson to address the crowd. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. The conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Good evening," Carson began, his voice resonating through the hall. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support St. Vincent's Hospital. This place isn't just a building. It's a lifeline for so many people, including someone very important to me." He paused, scanning the room as he gathered his thoughts. "My journey with this hospital has been personal. It's reminded me of the strength of community, the power of resilience, and the importance of standing by the people we care about. Tonight, we're not just raising funds, we're raising hope." The room broke into applause, and Carson felt a flicker of relief. As the clapping subsided, he continued, his tone softer but no less impactful. "Every dollar raised tonight will go toward ensuring that St. Vincent's can continue providing care for those who need it most. Thank you for being part of this mission and for reminding me of what truly matters." He stepped back as the applause swelled, nodding at Rebecca, who gave him an approving look. The first step of the night was complete, but Carson knew the real work was just beginning. As Carson stepped down from the stage, the applause still echoing in his ears, Bella rushed over to him with an excited grin. "You did great!" she exclaimed, her small hands clapping enthusiastically. "Everyone was listening so carefully, even me." Carson couldn't help but chuckle, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot coming from my toughest critic." Rebecca approached swiftly, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and focus. "The auction is starting in 15 minutes, she informed him. "Your presence at the first few tables will set the tone. After that, feel free to mingle, but don't let the press corner you too long." "Understood," Carson replied, glancing at Bella. "Ellis, can you keep an eye on her for a bit?" Ellis nodded from nearby, giving Bella a reassuring smile. "We'll stay close. Don't worry." As Carson moved toward the first table, a voice called out from behind him. "Miller, always stealing the spotlight, aren't you?" He turned to see Francois strolling toward him, a glass of champagne in hand and a smirk plastered across his face. Dressed impeccably, Francois looked every bit the part of a man used to commanding attention. Carson's jaw tightened, but he forced a polite smile, refusing to let Francois disrupt the evening. "Francois," Carson said evenly, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Well, I couldn't resist," Francois replied, his tone laced with faux charm. "Supporting such a noble cause, after all. And of course, watching you attempt to salvage what's left of your reputation." Carson stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "If you're here to make a scene, don't bother. This event isn't about me, or you. It's about something bigger." Francois's smirk deepened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he raised his glass in a mock toast. "Here's to the good fight, then. May the best man win." As Francois walked away, Carson exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He knew the man wasn't done scheming, but tonight wasn't the time to engage. Rebecca appeared at his side moments later, her sharp eyes tracking Francois's movements. "He's up to something," she said quietly. "I know," Carson replied, his gaze still fixed on Francois's retreating figure. "But tonight isn't about him. Let's focus on making this event a success." Rebecca nodded, her expression hardening. "Agreed. But I'll keep an eye on him just in case." Carson turned his attention back to the auction, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with key donors. The energy in the room was electric, the bidding for the first few items exceeding expectations. As the night progressed, Carson felt a renewed sense of purpose. The success of the gala wasn't just a victory for the hospital. It was a statement that Francois's attempts to undermine him were failing. From across the room, Bella watched him closely, her eyes filled with admiration. Ellis leaned down, whispering something that made Bella giggle, but her gaze quickly returned to Carson. For the first time, she saw not just a businessman, but someone willing to fight for the people he cared about. As the final auction item was announced, a private dinner with Carson himself, Rebecca signaled him to take the stage one last time. Carson stepped forward, the crowd's applause welcoming him back. "This has been an incredible evening," Carson began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Together we've raised more than I could have imagined, not just in funds, but in hope. Thank you for showing what we can achieve when we come together." The room erupted in applause once more, and as Carson stepped off the stage, Bella ran to meet him, throwing her arms around his waist. He crouched down, hugging her tightly, the noise of the room fading into the background. "You did it," Bella whispered, her voice filled with pride. "No," Carson said softly, looking into her eyes. "We did it, together." For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And for once that was enough. The air in the hospital room felt lighter than it had in weeks. Celine sat upright in her bed, a hint of color returning to her cheeks as sunlight streamed through the window. Bella sat beside her, holding one of her mother's hands tightly, her face glowing with happiness. Carson stood near the foot of the bed, his hands in his pockets, watching the scene with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. "You look better, Mum," Bella said, her voice bright with hope. "Like a lot better." Celine smiled softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I feel better, sweetheart. Not perfect, but better than I have in a long time." Carson couldn't help but nod in agreement. The treatment had been grueling, and there were still challenges ahead, but the progress was undeniable. Dr. Thompson had called it promising, though she had been careful to temper expectations. For Carson, just seeing Celine like this, smiling, alert, and engaged, felt like a victory. "You've been a fighter," Carson said, stepping closer. "I knew you could do it." Celine glanced at him, her smile tinged with playfulness. "Don't act like you're not surprised. There were moments I didn't think I could do it either." "But you did," Bella chimed in, her grip on Celine's hand tightening. "You're the strongest person I know." Celine's eyes glistened with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "I had a lot of help," she said, her gaze shifting between Bella and Carson. "I wouldn't have made it without you two." Carson cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the weight of her gratitude. He wasn't used to this kind of acknowledgement. It was raw, genuine, and a reminder of how much he had almost lost. "We're in this together," he said simply, his voice steady. "That's not going to change." Ellis entered the room then, carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the small table beside Celine's bed. "Bella told me you're getting your appetite back." Celine chuckled softly. "She's right. I'm actually starving." Ellis gave a satisfied nod. "Good. That means we're on the right track." As the room filled with the quiet sounds of conversation and laughter, Carson stepped back, letting the moment wash over him. It had been a long road to get here, full of uncertainty, pain, and more than a few moments of doubt. But standing here now, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He caught Bella's eye, and she grinned at him, her expression brighter than he'd ever seen. Carson felt a pang of pride mixed with gratitude. She had been the glue that held everything together, the quiet force that kept them moving forward. "Dad," Bella said suddenly, her voice breaking into his thoughts. The word still felt new, but hearing it from her lips filled him with a warmth he couldn't describe. "Are we still going to the park tomorrow? Mom said she wants to come with us." Celine raised an eyebrow, a playful challenge in her expression. "If I'm up for it," she said, though the determination in her voice left little room for doubt. Carson nodded, smiling. "Absolutely. We'll make a day of it." The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Carson wasn't afraid of it. Together, they had faced the worst and come out stronger. Now, it was time to build something new, something worth holding on to. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, the autumn sun casting a golden hue over the city. Carson parked the car near the entrance to Central Park, turning to glance at Celine in the passenger seat. She looked better than she had in weeks, her face alight with anticipation. Bella sat in the back, practically bouncing with excitement. "You sure you're up for this?" Carson asked, his tone teasing but tinged with genuine concern. Celine gave him a mock glare. "Don't you start babying me now. I've been looking forward to this." Bella giggled. "Mum's tough, Dad. She can handle it." The word Dad still caught Carson off guard, but each time Bella said it, it felt more natural. He smiled, stepping out of the car and opening the door for Celine. She accepted his hand, steadying herself as she got out, and together they began their walk into the park. The vibrant colours of fall surrounded them. Crimson, gold, and orange leaves fluttered down from the trees as they strolled along the winding paths. Bella darted ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased a flock of pigeons near the fountain. Carson and Celine walked at a slower pace, her hand resting lightly on his arm for support. "It feels good to be out," Celine said, her voice soft but content. "For a while, I didn't think I'd see this again." Carson glanced at her, his expression serious. "You're going to see a lot more of it," he said firmly. "This is just the beginning." Celine smiled, her grip on his arm tightening slightly. "I hope you're right." They reached a quiet clearing, where Bella was waiting for them with a blanket she had insisted on bringing. "Picnic time!" she declared, spreading the blanket on the ground with dramatic flair. Carson chuckled, helping her set up the small basket of snacks Ellis had packed for them. As they sat together, the simple joy of the moment filled the air. Bella shared stories about her latest school project, her enthusiasm infectious as she described her drawings and ideas. Celine listened intently, occasionally chiming in with questions or encouragement. At one point, Bella leaned against Carson, her head resting on his shoulder. "This is the best day," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. Carson glanced at Celine, who smiled at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It really is," he agreed, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. For a long time they sat there, soaking in the peace of the moment. The laughter, the warmth, the unspoken promises. They were all pieces of a life they were finally building together. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Carson stood and extended a hand to Celine. "Ready to head home?" he asked. She nodded, taking his hand as she rose to her feet. Bella grabbed the blanket and basket, skipping ahead of them as they walked back toward the car. In that moment, Carson knew they had reached the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Together, they had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Whatever the future held, they would face it as a family. And for the first time in his life, Carson felt truly whole.